Veteran Affairs Secretary David Shulkin has been ousted from the Veterans Department. And part of the reason why is because there has been some fallout between him and Donald Trump. We'll get to those details in just a minute. But he has been replaced by Ronny L. Jackson, an individual that you might have read about fairly recently because he was the person who gave an hour-long press conference in regard to Donald Trump's health and condition. Now, Trump said Wednesday that he was removing Shulkin and tapping Admiral Ronny Jackson, the White House physician, as his replacement, ending weeks of uncertainty at the embattled agency. Now, Donald Trump decided to take to Twitter to broadcast this news to everyone. And he said, "I'm pleased to announce that I intend to nominate highly respected Admiral Ronny L. Jackson, MD, as the new Secretary of Veterans Affairs."
At least you spelled veterans correctly.
Actually, that was not a bad tweet. You know, the proper words were capitalized. It was impressive. You know, low standards, but still impressive. All right. So he also said, in the interim, Honorary Robert Wilkie of the Department of Defense will serve as acting secretary. I am thankful for Dr. David Shulkin's service to our country and to our great veterans. Now, the big question here is how much of this decision had to do with the fact that there are certain members within Trump's administration that are pushing for the privatization of the VA. And it seems like that is one of the largest reasons. And also, why is it that Ronny Jackson is stepping in now? How is he qualified to fill this position? And just to give you a little information about him, he served as a presidential physician since 2013, so meaning under the Obama administration. His experience in the White House goes back to the George W. Bush administration. He was also in charge of resuscitative medicine for the trauma response unit during the Iraq War. He also praised Trump's health and has credited him for his good genes. So he was complimentary toward Trump, which could give you some idea as to why Trump would tap him to fill Secretary David Shulkin's role in the VA.
Yeah, that'll carry a long way with this administration, with this president, certainly. And the notion that they want to privatize the VA is the whole game, probably. There's always the palace intrigue that goes on with the Trump administration, everybody in that White House is jockeying for position. There are leaks from everyone. There are conspiracies to oust certain people. That has been going on since the first hour, and it continues to go on. But what's happening at the VA is there's a big push to privatize it. And there's a big push to privatize a lot of things that are associated with everything in government, including the military. We've talked about that before. Eric Prince, who is connected to this White House, wants a privatization of many military endeavors. But anyway, on the VA, he was sort of viewed as the last bulwark, the thing that was going to be the last step in holding up the privatization of the VA. He was the one argument against privatizing it. So get him out, because we want to privatize this whole organization. And that argument won the day here.
All right, so let's get into the infighting, the conflict, the drama, and how this all came about, because I think the inner workings of the administration are fascinating, especially in this case. Now, keep in mind, I want to preface everything by mentioning that there have been numerous members of Trump's administration who have raised eyebrows because of their very, I guess, generous spending of taxpayer money on things like travel, and they're still within the administration. They have not been fired. Tom Price was the only person who stepped down because of how much he had spent on travel. However, there are other members of Trump's administration who have spent money on ridiculous things, and they're still there. But it seems as though the excuses for getting rid of Shulkin had to do with the way that he had spent taxpayer money. Now, let's talk about the privatization issue. At the heart of the dispute between Shulkin and Trump appointees were changes to a program known as Choice that allows some veterans to seek private health care. Shulkin favored a modest expansion of the program that would still leave it up to the VA doctors whether patients can seek private care. Now, again, he was kind of the person who prevented the floodgates of privatization within the VA. And there were members of Trump's team that did not like that. So successes with the department, David Shulkin wrote in the New York Times, successes within the department have intensified the ambitions of people who want to put VA healthcare in the hands of the private sector. I believe differences in philosophy deserve robust debate, and solutions should be determined based on the merits of the arguments. The advocates for privatizing VA health services, however, reject this approach. He continues to write in his op-ed, and by the way, this was after he was fired. They saw me as an obstacle to privatization who had to be removed. That is because I am convinced that privatization is a political issue aimed at rewarding select people and companies with profits, even if it undermines care for veterans. Now let's get into the issue of spending taxpayer money. The Trump administration is trying to make it seem as though they got rid of him because of a misuse of funds. And again, there have been other members of the administration who have misused taxpayer money, but they're still there. So I see this as an excuse, even though I do agree that he shouldn't have spent the money in the way that was outlined here. Now, let's go to graphic 11. Feelings on Shulkin began to sour in February when the VA's Inspector General released a report on a trip to Europe over the summer that found Shulkin spent most of his time sightseeing rather than conducting official business, and improperly accepted tickets to a Wimbledon tennis match as a gift. Apparently, his wife also accompanied him on that trip. And after this report came out, Shulkin said, "I will 100% reimburse the government for those funds." And it didn't matter. They decided to get rid of him anyway because it wasn't about the misuse of taxpayer money. There are numerous members of Trump's administration who misuse taxpayer money. This was all about seeing him as an obstacle to privatizing the VA, and so they used that as an excuse to get rid of him.
Yeah, and it's funny when it really is laughable when they talk about some kind of honest debate on subjects. And Trump even says, well, I like to put two people who disagree on things in a room. I listen to the arguments and then I make a decision. No, that's not really the way it works. What you really do is you put two people who agree with you in a room, and then you decide how you're going to pursue whatever policy you've already decided you're going to pursue. And that was the case here. He was an obstacle to that. He wants that privatization. And look, he doesn't sound like the kind of guy who I would necessarily make my pal, because I do think that he went to great, shall we say, there was considerable excess in the way he took that vacation and he laid it on thick. Having said that, he is right. He's probably the guy who evaluated what's going on at the VA and felt the privatization was a bad idea. So in that sense, he's right, and it's a loss to the VA, Shulkin's departure. However, when you get to the guy who's going to replace him, you're talking about a guy who has no management experience.
That's right.
You got to understand the VA is a huge organization that's charged with tremendous responsibilities to help veterans who are in crisis often. I mean, there's a huge PTSD problem. There's a huge suicide problem. There's a huge problem we've heard about the veterans literally dying because they're waiting for treatments that they're not getting. So this is an administration that's besieged by problems, the VA. You need a management structure in there that is really going to make a difference. A guy who's never really been involved with management is not the choice to replace him, even though he's really good at complimenting the president.
That's exactly right. And my concern is that you privatize the VA and the care is not going to improve, it's actually going to get worse. Now, one of the issues with the VA was how severely underfunded it was. There wasn't enough attention and enough resources being pumped into the VA to ensure that we were doing right by our veterans. And there is no reason to believe that the private sector is going to do better with our veterans, considering the way that they're dealing with the American people in general. And David Shulkin made that point in his New York Times op-ed, and I completely agree with him on this. So graphic 10. He says the private sector, already struggling to provide adequate access to care in many communities, is ill-prepared to handle the number and complexity of patients that would come from closing or downsizing VA hospitals and clinics, particularly when it involves the mental health needs of people scarred by the horrors of war. And so I think that he had some legitimate concerns there, but as he also mentioned, there was no room for robust debate. Members of Trump's team have already made up their mind in regard to privatizing the VA, and it seems like they're headed in that direction.
They don't care about veterans. They just don't. They're all show and no go. It's all that other military. I want to have a military parade to celebrate our military. But when they talk about funding the military, they're not funding the VA. They're not funding PTSD and suicide problems and opiate abuse, that all of which afflicts the veterans in record numbers now. They're not talking about that. All they're talking about is ways to make money. So they dole out to their corporate pals and private businesses pieces of the VA, and they're going to slice it up and privatize it, and it'll all be about money, and the actual services provided to veterans will be lost.
It's pretty devastating, and if you look at the track record of this administration, you will see instances of members of Trump's cabinet awarding these huge government contracts to their pals. And Betsy DeVos is the recent example. The Education Department just gave out a huge government contract to a debt collection agency that DeVos used to be invested in. So there's no reason to believe that this isn't an attempt to push for more sweetheart deals for their little cronies.
If you become a member of the Young Turks, you'll be saying,
I'm like a smart person.
So do it right now, tytnetwork.com/join. Get the whole Young Turks show every day.